Sure.
Okay, I'm ready.
All right. Serhii Kudelia, Associate Professor of Political Science, Baylor University.
Okay, can you spell them for me?
Sergiy is first name, last name Kudelia.
Okay. And it's pronounced Cordelia.
Yes,
Okay.
right.
All right, Professor Cordelia, we give updates to our viewers every day, several times a day, on where the tensions between Russia and Ukraine stand currently. But a lot of the news reporting lacks how we got here. What caused us to get to this boiling point in the first place? So I'm hoping you can kind of share some kind of background history on how we got to this point between Russia and Ukraine.
Sure. So the relationship between Russia and Ukraine has been difficult since the collapse of the Soviet Union, primarily because Russia for a long would not recognize the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and some of the territories that Ukraine had after the collapse of the Soviet Union were claimed by Russia as well, specifically Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. And in 2014, eight years ago, or about 8 years ago, right after the revolution in Kiev, when Ukraine was very weak as a state, the president fled, the new authorities came into power. Russia used this moment of weakness in Ukraine in order to annex part of its territory, specifically Crimea, and invade other parts of Ukrainian territory in the east. And since then, for the following 8 years, Ukraine refused to recognize the annexation of Crimea, claimed Crimea as its territory, and it also was faced with a long-running, low-intensity conflict in the eastern part of the country, where the insurgents, which were helped by Russia, assisted, guided, ordered by Russia, were fighting a separatist conflict, established their own republics, have been challenging the Ukrainian authority over significant territory. And the conflict really intensified between Russia and Ukraine over the last several years when Zelensky, the new president of Ukraine, came to power. He initially was interested in making a deal with Putin, but then he quickly understood that making a deal with Putin may cost him his presidency, because a large number of Ukrainians are actually against any compromise with the Russian president. And hence, he decided to continue the policy of confrontation with Russia. He decided to dismiss all of the demands that were coming from Moscow. And at some Putin decided to increase the stakes, to raise the costs that Ukraine would have to bear in this confrontation, and started to increase the troops around the Ukrainian borders, threatening basically a full-fledged invasion.
How much does NATO play a role here? There's talk that Putin doesn't want Ukraine to be invited into NATO, and I know there were deals in the past that said it wouldn't expand anymore that way. Is that just posturing? Is that just a way to just say that's part of the problem, or is it really a part of the problem?
Well, it is part of the problem because Russia has consistently opposed the enlargement of NATO. When it began in the mid-1990s, Boris Yeltsin, the Russian president at that time, strongly objected to the inclusion of Central European, Eastern European, like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic into NATO. And all the following enlargement waves of NATO that included some of the former Soviet republics as well, the Baltic states, were objected by Russia. But of course, all of the objections, Russia's objections, were dismissed at that time by NATO, and Russia was a weak country, a much weaker country than it is today under Putin. And hence, Putin decided to draw a line, to draw a line for NATO and say that the NATO enlargement has to stop. And if you decide to bring in Ukraine as well, this will be intolerable as far as Russia's security concerns, security interests are concerned. And you have to remember that on the western border, Ukraine is the largest state for Russia. And Russia, for many centuries, faced threats, primary threats, and invasions, primarily west from multiple European states: France, Germany, Sweden, Poland. All of these countries have been fighting Russia at different points in history. And so Russia wanted, traditionally, preferred to develop what they call street depth, forming a buffer area or buffer state between Russia and the Western alliance in order to protect itself better in case the West decides to invade. So in my these concerns that Putin has expressed are genuine, and they need to be seriously considered by the Western states.
If it seems like we're hesitant as well to allow Ukraine into NATO, wouldn't we be forced at that point, if Ukraine was a part of NATO, to go in there with our troops, and other countries involved in NATO, to actually put troops on the ground in Ukraine if they were a part of it?
Absolutely. NATO is a defense alliance. And so if one of the members of NATO is invaded, others have to step in and immediately provide protection, assistance. And for this reason, of course, Putin believes that he might view the likelihood of Ukraine's membership in NATO as quite low, because Ukraine, as I said, is waging a separatist war in the east of its country, of the country. And so for this reason, any attempt or any inclusion of Ukraine into NATO would automatically trigger a conflict between the West and Russia. And so this is not something that the Western countries would support. I also have to say that even though Ukraine was promised NATO membership at the Bucharest summit in 2008, over the last 13 years, there have been no tangibles made on the part of NATO in order to bring Ukraine closer. There has been an enhanced military cooperation between Ukraine and some countries, specifically the United States. But these were bilateral relations, and the United States, Canada, they provided a lot of security assistance in building up Ukrainian military and transferring Ukrainian military to a more modern, or modernizing the Ukrainian military standards. But these were not actions that were taken by NATO as an alliance. And in fact, there are a number of countries within NATO, like France and Germany, that are rather influential, that strongly object to Ukraine's membership in NATO. So in fact, in the short term, the Ukraine's membership in NATO is highly unlikely. But what Putin is doing right now is he wants to acquire certain long-term guarantees. He understands that in the short term, Ukraine will not be a member of NATO, but who knows what's going to happen in the long term. And that's why he calls on the West to provide some formal guarantees for a longer period of time that Ukraine will never be admitted into the Western military alliance.
Okay, real quickly, in your opinion, how does this play out? Does Russia invade Ukraine? And does that ever lead to a situation where American troops will be fighting Russian troops?
I think the likelihood of Russia's invasion right now is 50-50. We are seeing in the last couple of weeks an intensified deployments, military deployments of Russian troops along the Ukrainian border. And that signals that Putin's intentions are serious and that his threats are credible. Now, we have to understand that the only purpose or objective that Putin would want to pursue by invading Ukraine is not to capture and bring it under Moscow's control, but to invade Ukraine, start a conflict, and impose a more preferred set of compromises or concessions on the Ukrainian authorities. In other words, his goal is not to expand Russia, but to persuade the Ukrainian leadership to agree not to take sides against the Russian state. And that means primarily to adopt a neutral position, Finland or like Sweden or like Switzerland, all of these countries that are currently neutral and pursued neutrality exactly because they were viewed as countries that were attractive to different sides, to Russia and the West at different points in their history. And so that is the objective that Putin is seeking at this point. There have been a number of diplomatic efforts, specifically by the Europeans over the last days, and today President of France, Emmanuel Macron, was visiting Moscow, and there may be some progress on the diplomatic track. And Europeans would actually, seems like Europeans are more willing to engage in serious negotiations with the United States than the Americans. So if there is a diplomatic bargain that prevents war, it is likely to be reached or negotiated by the European leaders.
Since what you're saying is Russia's goal isn't for a takeover of Ukraine and to expand Russia, is it less likely that other countries would be willing to put their own boots on the ground? If this is really just Russia wanting Ukraine to, accept neutrality in the future in certain situations, wouldn't that make it more likely to other countries are going to just hands off and let's see where this goes?
It is very unlikely that the West, or specifically the United States, would deploy military troops into Ukraine. There will be military deployments, obviously, along Ukrainian borders, specifically in Poland. There will be the conflict, if it begins, will produce a large number of and create additional security challenges to members of NATO like Poland or like Hungary or Czech Republic, these Eastern European states. But the United States or other European states already said that there will be no military deployments in Ukraine. There will be significant military assistance, though, and the United States is leading as a leading country in terms of the provision, in terms of the amount of military assistance that has been provided. But it is clear from the position of the United States, the European states, that they expect Ukrainians to fight for their own country. They do not plan to send any troops to Ukraine.
Last question. In your opinion, you hear people out there talking about this. Has NATO outlived its purpose? I believe 1949. Has it outlived its purpose? Is it still needed?
So there is an argument that is a dysfunctional alliance, because it includes already a large number of states, and hence it cannot organize or function well. But you have to also remember that the threats that emerge in today's world, they are of course different from the threats that existed after World War II. There is no threat of the revival of the German militarism, for example. One of the reasons why NATO was created was to make sure that Germany is not revived in any shape or form. That problem has been solved. But another reason why it was created was to keep the Soviets out, and arguably that threat of now not the Soviet Russians still remains. And so I think the recent rise in tensions along the Ukrainian border, it would indicate to many in the West that the United States still needs to provide significant security to Europe in order for the Europeans to feel sufficiently safe. All the attempts of the Europeans to create their own security alliance have failed so far. President of France, Emmanuel Macron, suggested that there may be another attempt to create a Western European security alliance. I don't think it is going to happen. So even though NATO is not obviously the optimal organization, but the best out of all the alternatives, it is better than the alternative of chaos and the absence of security on the European continent.
All right, you've made me understand a lot more. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that I should have?
Well, I can talk a little about what's happening within Ukraine if you want to. I've been to Ukraine over the last month, and I spent time in Western Ukraine. I traveled around Ukraine, and I have to say that the level of anxiety among Ukrainians is much lower than the level of anxiety among many Westerners, Americans or Europeans, especially if you read the reports in the media. And in fact, most of the Ukrainians, from my perception, actually believe that the war with Russia is highly unlikely. They do not think that Putin is going to invade. And I think for many that this information, so much discussion in the Western media around this conflict really does more harm to Ukraine than good, because it already produced certain economic issues or economic problems or challenges for Ukraine. The currency depreciated, the foreign investors are leaving Ukraine. And so even in the absence of any kind of Russian invasion, Ukraine is already paying the price, and it's paying the price primarily because of that significant attention that has been paid to Ukraine over the last months by the Western media and Western governments.
Very interesting. I didn't even think of that. That's very interesting. All right, Professor, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me.
Have a good evening.
Okay. Take care, Adam.
You too. Bye.